Good afternoon. There are AAPOR members coming back from various lunches at various meetings, and if there's a spot at your table and you see somebody looking for a spot, please welcome them. So, this is time for the presidential address for David Dutwin, and I have to say that the only hard part about serving on council with David Dutwin this year has been the prospect of giving this introduction. Because I'm supposed to say something at least mildly amusing about David, and this is a person who does not slip on banana peels. There are so many things about David that are predictable. For example, you won't be surprised at David's list of outstanding professional accomplishments. He's the Executive Vice President and Chief Methodologist at SSRS, which looks like an absolutely fantastic place to work. They even have a giraffe, and it looks like one of our council members is photobombing David's group in this picture. He has the usual list of impressive professional accomplishments, senior research and teaching positions, and the usual long list of excellent publications sampled here. Then came the first surprise. David anticipated by a decade the impulse to unplug. Unplug your kids does seem like good advice, but most children would say to any grown-up, great idea, you go first. And where does AAPOR fit into David's busy life? David's relationship with AAPOR had a stellar launch when David won the Student Paper Award in 2002. And predictably, David followed that with years of extraordinary service to AAPOR and its community of members. The Transparency Initiative introduced the seal of approval just for David. You might assume that to accomplish all that he has, David must work all the time. Not so. The list of David's interests and activities is as long as the list of accomplishments. David started out with baseball and track and field, but seemed to prefer the cold and danger of snowboarding and ice climbing with a break on the water in the off-season. At a young age, he experimented with the world of politics, but it didn't take. David also has a lifelong interest in music. As a youngster, David played guitar with a band, Neville Street Groove, where he was known by his nom de guitar, Thunderpick. By this point, I was convinced that the man excelled at everything except cooking and cleaning. Wrong. And wrong again. I made those up. I just made them up. Don't ask David to flambe for you. I don't know what would happen. Then I learned something about David I did not expect. It turns out that David has a fascination with game shows, and I didn't make that up. Well, David, you have given David so much that we wanted to give you something in return. The chance to live the dream, your very own game show. And what game show has survey research at its heart? Yes, Family Feud. What better game show for an organization that many of us consider a second family? I adapted the classic Family Feud method by surveying 100 of David's closest friends, families, and colleagues. David's job is to guess what the survey says. Unfortunately, only 10 people responded to my survey. A quick non-response analysis revealed the primary reasons for non-response. Too busy? Not interested? How much will you pay me? That's not enough. Is there a citizenship question? It's just like work, you know. Because of this non-participation, some responses had to be imputed, which is to say we made them up. So now that we've satisfied the AAPOR code by being transparent about our data fabrication, let's play AAPOR Family Feud. The first question we asked David's 10 friends was, how would you describe David's music career? Let's see what David says. Legendary is consistent with what we learned in our research. Let's see what the survey says. Sorry, David, but what was the #1 answer given by your friends? An utter disaster? Well, I guess you can see what they mean. Looks like the only other answer was, he loves his dog. That doesn't make much sense, but Cody is awfully cute. No score in that round, David, but 2 more chances. The next question we asked David's friend was, What's the best way to get information from people? What do you think, David? Do a survey. That makes a lot of sense and should be a winner in this crowd. Let's see a survey on the board. Great, you made it on the board. Unfortunately, only one person mentioned surveys. Let's see what other methods your friends suggest. Big data mining / hacking, those don't really go together. Social media / cyber stalking, those aren't really the same thing either. But it looks like there's one more. Dragon fire, dragon glass? Definitely not an AAPOR best practice. Even survey research isn't safe from Game of Thrones. And it looks like those non-respondents suddenly appeared on the board. But you did score in this round, David. Well, this game has not turned out quite the way I expected. But the last question is one that you're definitely an expert on, David. What is David's greatest accomplishment? Not sure what McDonald's guitar means, David. Your greatest accomplishment is playing guitar at McDonald's? For McDonald's? Whatever, I have to wrap this up. Let's see what the survey says. Unbelievable. Playing guitar at McDonald's is on the board. I'm sure it seemed great at the time, but it's hard to imagine a greatest accomplishment worse than playing guitar at McDonald's. Clearly, there is something worse. But all of this McDonald's stuff is confusing. Fortunately, the research elves were able to clarify that what David really meant was playing guitar with McDonald's All-American Jazz Band. Yes, David may be one of the few AAPOR members and only president who is certified All-American. But there are a few more spots on the board. Let's see what David's friends think are his greatest accomplishments. AAPOR Committee on Everything, AAPOR Task Force on Everything, and last, President of AAPOR. And those non-respondents chime back in again to agree enthusiastically. There you have it, David. Your greatest accomplishment was being AAPOR's president, and now it's almost over. Well, although David had some challenges with AAPOR Family Feud, I can see why his coworkers describe him as a Renaissance man. Please welcome AAPOR's president, David Dutwin.
Thank you so much, Narcade. That was an eye-opening introduction. I feel slightly violated, but few people get an opportunity to write a presidential address, and so as I was going through the process, I thought it'd be pretty important to document it for the AAPOR Presidential Archives, and I realized as working through this speech that really writing an AAPOR presidential address is much like working through the Kubler-Ross model, which you may popularly know as the 5 stages of grief. Of course, being AAPOR president is a continual process in history in the making, so we had, drum roll please, we had the AAPOR presidential photographer there every step of the way documenting every move, and though it's a little painful, in the spirit of transparency, I present to you the process and history of presenting an AAPOR presidential address. The first stage is, of course, denial. And for me, this occurred right around New Year's. It was a glorious time, really. As you can see, the phase lasted for quite a while, and I suspect this is probably true for most AAPOR presidents. I then unfortunately moved to the anger stage, and this came quite unexpectedly as draft after draft failed on the cutting room floor. And I do have to apologize right now for taking out some anger inappropriately at the AAPOR photographer. Bargaining is the next stage, and though I'm not a deeply religious man, I did what I could. Unfortunately, it did nothing but push me to the depression stage, and needless to say, it was a dark time. So much so I can't even show a picture of myself, but this is how it felt. But okay. At long last, there is the stage of acceptance. It was a long road and a tough road, but I hope in what follows you'll find that it was all worth the effort. Many of you know me as a survey methodologist, but in fact, my path to AAPOR had nothing to do with methodology. My early papers, in fact, wholly provided criticism of or underscored the critical value of public opinion and public opinion polls. And so in some respect, this AAPOR address for me completes a full circle of thought and passion I have for AAPOR. For today, I'd like to discuss matters pertaining to the need to reconsider, strengthen, advance the mission of survey research in our democracy. Historically, there's been much to say on the role of public opinion in democracy. George Gallup summarized the role of polls quite succinctly when he said, "Without polls, elites would be guided only by letters to congressmen, lobbying of pressure groups, and the reports of political henchmen." Further, democratic theory notes the critical, if not pivotal, role of public opinion in democratic practice. Storied political scientist V.O. Key said, "The poll furnishes a means for the deflation of the extreme claims of pressure groups and for the testing of their extravagant claims of public sentiment and the support of their public demands." This is why I have my students read V.O. Key, because he's almost unintelligible. But furthermore, surveys provide a critical check and balance for what the others claim that Americans think of their policies and their government. Without polls, it would really be all that much harder to verify and combat claims of public sentiment made by politicians, elites, and lobbyists. It's sometimes asked whether leaders do consult polls and whether polls actually do have any impact on public policy. The relationship here is complex, but time and again, researchers have found meaningful and significant effects of public opinion measured by polling on public policy. In one example, Page and Shapiro explored these trends from 1930 to 1980 and found no less than 231 different changes in public policy immediately following shifts in public opinion. And certainly in modern times around the world, there's a recognition that the loss of public opinion would indeed be a loss of democracy itself. Unfortunately, not all agree. Some twist polling to be a tool that works against democratic principles. And certainly, public opinion itself is imperfect. It's filled with non-attitudes, the will of the crowd, and the tyranny of the majority, as Jon Stewart once nicely pointed out. If these later quotes were the extent of the criticism on the role of public opinion in survey research and democracy, I wouldn't be up here today discussing what follows. But unfortunately, we live in a world where many of the institutions of democracy and society are under attack. It's important to start by recognizing that AAPOR is a scientific organization. Whether you're a qualitative researcher or a quantitative researcher, a political pollster or a developer of official statistics, a sociologist or a political scientist, someone who works for a commercial entity or a nonprofit, we're all survey scientists. And so we, AAPOR, have to be as concerned as any other scientific community about science being under attack, devalued, and delegitimized. It's estimated that since the 2016 election, the federal policy has moved to censor, misrepresent, curtail, or suppress scientific data and discoveries over 200 times, according to the Sabin Center at Columbia University. Not only is this a concern for AAPOR as a community of scientists, but we should all be concerned as well on the impact this has on public opinion itself. Just as concerning is the attack on democratic information in general. Farrell and Schneier argue that there are two types of knowledge in a democracy, common and contested. And we should be free to argue about policy choices, our pick of democratic leaders, or even the mores and rules that guide us as a society, what's called contested knowledge. But what cannot be up for debate is common knowledge of democracy. That is, the legitimacy of the electoral process itself, the validity of data attained by the census, or even more so, I would argue, that public opinion doesn't actually tell us what the public thinks. As many of these quotes earlier attest to, democracy is dependent upon a reliable and non-ideological measure of the will of the people. For more than half a century and beyond, survey research is the principal and predominant vehicle by which this knowledge is generated. And yet, we are on the doorstep where common knowledge is being contested. We're entering, I fear, a new phase of poll delegitimization. I'm not here to advocate any political ideology, and it is important for us to remain in the confines of science. Yet there's been a sea change in how polls are discussed by the current administration. To constantly call out polls for their being fake is to delegitimize public opinion itself and is a threat to our profession. Worse still, many call out polls as simply propaganda. Such statements are even more a direct attack on our science and, frankly, the entire AAPOR community. Even worse is to rig poll results. Perhaps nothing may undermine the science and legitimacy of polling more. And more pernicious still, we're on the precipice of an age where faking anything is possible. The technology now exists to fake videos of politicians for the saying of false statements, and the faking of poll results is merely in lockstep in these developments. Now, there's many of you in this room who may not really connect with this. You don't do political polling. You do government statistics, sociology, research on health, or consumer research. What's the fuss? Well, we must all realize that polling is the tip of the spear. It is what the ordinary citizen sees of our trade and our science. As Andy Kohut once noted, it represents all of survey research. With attacks on science at an all-time high in the modern age, including attacks on the science of surveys, with denigration of the common knowledge, the glue that holds democracy together, with the denunciation of the reliability of official statistics, with slander on polling that goes beyond deliberation of the validity of good methods, but rather attacks good methods as junk propaganda and fake news. And worst of all, a future, by all indications, will include anything but the increased frequency of fake polls and fake data. Well, what are we, AAPOR, to do about this? We must respond. We must react, and we must speak out. Well, what does this mean? First, AAPOR must be able to respond. We must be able to have the vehicles and avenues of communication and tools by which we can communicate. Second, AAPOR must know how to respond, and that is to say we must have effective and timely means of responding. We're in an every minute of the day news cycle. AAPOR has to adapt to this environment and maximize its impact by speaking effectively within this communication environment. And third, AAPOR must simply have the willpower to respond. AAPOR is a fabulous member organization, providing great service to its members in terms of education, code of ethics, guidelines for best practices, promotions of transparency and diversity. But we have to do more. We have to learn to professionalize and communicate and advocate for the members in our field. There are no such thing as sidelines anymore. We have to do our part to defend survey science, polling, and the very role of public opinion in a functioning democracy. Now, this might seem to some of you like a bold, fresh idea for AAPOR, but in fact, there's been a common and consistent call for improved communication abilities, communicative outreach, and advocacy by many presidents, from Diane Colasantro to Nancy Belden to Andy Kohut. Past President Frank Newport, for example, was and is a strong supporter of the role of public opinion in democracy, underscoring in his presidential address that, quote, "The collective views of the people are absolutely vital to the decision-making that ultimately affects them." He argued in his presidential address that AAPOR must protect the role of public opinion in society. A number of other past presidents have rightly noted that AAPOR must recognize the central role of journalists in this regard, who have the power to frame polling in a positive or negative influence on society. President Nancy Mathewitz rightly pointed out that AAPOR must play a role in and even financially support endeavors to guarantee journalists' support of AAPOR's position on the role of polling in society and journalists' treatment of polls. And Nancy's vision, in fact, launched a partnership with Poynter in building a number of resources for journalist education. Past President Scott Keeter also noted the need for AAPOR to do everything it can to promote public opinion research. He said, quote, "We all do everything we can to defend high-quality survey research, its producers, and those who distribute it." But at the same time, Scott noted that unfortunately, at AAPOR, we're fighting mostly a defensive war. And finally, past President Cliff Zukin got straight to the point in his address, noting that, quote, AAPOR needs to increase its organizational capacity and to respond and communicate both internally and externally. We need to communicate our positions and values to the outside world, and we need to diffuse ideas more quickly within our profession. AAPOR is a wonderful organization, and in my biased opinion, the best professional organization I know. How have we responded to the call of past presidents? I would say we've responded with vigor, energy, and passion. But we're a volunteer organization of social scientists. So we make task forces. We write reports. And these reports are incredibly well-researched, well-written, but yet at the same time, I would argue, do not effectively work within the modern communication environment. We've taken one small step to ameliorate this with the report on polling in the 2016 election, which publicly released quite successfully via live Facebook video event. But we can do better. We need to be more timely. For one, that event occurred 177 days after the election, when far fewer people were listening and the narrative was really largely already written. And we need to find ways to have such events have greater impact. And of course, we need more than one event every 4 years. I've been proud to be a part of and even the chair of a number of excellent task force reports, but I submit we cannot continue to respond just with task force reports. AAPOR is comprised of the greatest survey researchers in the world, but we are not comprised of professional communication strategists, plain and simple. We need help, and we need professional help. In the growth of many organizations, there comes a time when the next step must be taken. The ASA many years ago, for example, hired a full-time strategic communications firm. Other organizations, such as the NCA or APSA and others, chose instead to hire their own full-time professional communication strategist. AAPOR has desired to advocate for itself better for decades. We recognize that we have to get into the fight. We recognize there are no such thing as sidelines anymore. And we've put forward a commendable effort building journalist education, writing excellent reports on best practices, sugging and frugging, data falsification, and other issues. But we need to do more. And in the context of the world outside of us, we need to speak a language that resonates with journalists, political elites, and even the public. The Washington Post says that democracy dies in darkness. If I may, I would have to say that AAPOR says that democracy dies in silence, when the vehicle for public opinion, surveys, has been twisted to be distrusted by the very people who need it most, ordinary citizens. We can be silent no more. This year, Executive Council deliberated on these issues outlined in this address, and we have chosen to act. The road will be long, and at this point, I can't tell you exactly where it will lead, but I can tell you our intentions and aspirations. We've begun to execute a 5-point plan that I present to you here today. First, AAPOR Executive Council developed and released a request for proposals for professional strategic communication services. 5 highly regarded firms responded, and after careful deliberation and in-person meetings with the best of these firms, we have chosen Stanton Communications to help AAPOR become a more professionalized association. Our goals in the short term are as follows. We desire to be more nimble and effective at responding to attacks on polls, with key AAPOR members serving as spokespersons when needed, but only after professional development of the messages they will promulgate, approved by council and professionalized by the firm. Stanton brings with it a considerable distribution network of journalists and media outlets to reach out to. And AAPOR, through its professional management firm Kellen, has access to audio and video services at the National Press Club. We will utilize these services when needed to respond to attacks on polls and other communications deemed important by Executive Council. Our plan is to begin small. We're cognizant of the cost that professional communication can entail and thus have set very modest initial goals. The first step is to be prepared and to have a plan for the 2020 election, with fast response options of communication during the campaign and perhaps most importantly, directly thereafter. The second element of our plan is to re-envision AAPOR's role in journalism education. In short, we believe we need to now own this space, not farm it out to other entities. We need refreshed educational videos and many more of them, from explaining response rates to the common criticisms made on the use of horse race polling in the media. We need to travel. AAPOR members should be funded to travel to journalism conferences, newsrooms, and journalism schools on an annual basis. AAPOR could have other live events, for example, a forum on the use of polls in journalism. There should be a consistent applied effort over time because, after all, the media and journalists are AAPOR's greatest spokespeople. By and large, much of our image is shaped through them. The third element looks at the long game, and that is for AAPOR to develop a civics education on public opinion and the role of public opinion in democracy. With the help of educational experts, and importantly, tipping our hat to AAPOR's Got Talent winner last year, Allison Holbrook, who proposed exactly this kind of strategy, we believe AAPOR can develop a curriculum and educational materials and engage with educators to push for the inclusion of this curriculum in primary education. AAPOR can and should develop specific instructional objectives of civics education by grade and communication plans to lobby for the inclusion of this curriculum by educators. The fourth element is for AAPOR to direct the Transparency Initiative to develop a strategic plan for the next 10 years. We recognize it is not always the case that polls are executed with best practices. How does AAPOR respond to these instances? With a plethora of new sampling approaches and modalities, we do believe that the TI needs to have a full-throated conversation about these challenges and how AAPOR should handle them. After all, this too is part of AAPOR communication. And finally, as past President Tim Johnson called for last year, we need to learn as much as we can about polls in society. We cannot make effective strategic communication plans without knowing how they will resonate and know to what degree they may be effective. Such an effort should continue over time with building both a breadth and a depth of understanding. If this sounds a bit like a wish list, well, you would be right. And for now, the immediate goal for AAPOR and its communication firm, again, is to prepare for 2020 and take some modest steps toward professionalizing AAPOR's ability to quickly and effectively communicate and advocate. Looking toward the future, AAPOR Council has authorized the development of the Ad Hoc Committee on Public Opinion. This committee will be comprised of AAPOR members dedicated to pushing forward this agenda. We recognize the potential cost that these endeavors may have in terms of money and labor, and there will be mission leaders on the committee whose goal is to push forward with two principal goals. The first is funding. We realize we cannot actually fund all of these endeavors alone. We will be seeking foundational funding for each of these areas, and we'll be developing a proposal for foundation funding in each of these areas specifically. Perhaps only one area attains funding, perhaps all four do, but no matter, the committee will adjust its goals contingent on the means it has available. A number of members have already asked to be part of these efforts, and I thank you. But I call on you, the AAPOR membership, to reach out and join the effort as well. We need people experienced in seeking foundational funding, people passionate in moving the needle with regard to polling journalism, civics education, and the role of public opinion in democracy. AAPOR's secret sauce has always been the passion of its volunteers and members, and we call on you to help. If you're interested, please go to the link on this slide and come and join the effort. Friends and colleagues, one of the most excellent AAPOR task forces already, in fact, explored this issue, the Task Force on Polling and Democracy and Leadership. They argued that, quote, AAPOR should adopt an increased public presence, arguing for the importance of public opinion in a democracy and the importance for rigorous, unbiased, and scientific research assessing public opinion. It is time we start to realize these aspirations for the good of our association, our field, and our very democracy. If past efforts by AAPOR volunteers are any indication, we anticipate great success and health in the future of our field and our endeavors. Remember, through struggle and hard work, we hope and expect, like this AAPOR address, that we will ultimately come to that final stage of acceptance. It's been an honor and a privilege serving you as president. Thank you.